In the last lesson we had a look at making a variant array, and it was quite amazing how we could put one variable equal to a range of values. Well, the process is reversible as well. If we have we've declared our array as a variant and then we've assigned it to that range, how about if we do it the other way around? If we take the array and put it back on the spreadsheet. So use another button and something like this. In this case we're going in reverse this time. We're taking the company array, which we define up here, and by the way, you see it's declared in the general declarations, which means that company is known to both of those buttons. So this time, working from right to left as programming does, we take the array, we put it into C1 to D3, which is here, C1 to D3, which should be there. A little bit close for comfort, never mind. So we could try running that, and we assign our array to the variable, and then you see we can simply put the array in another location. So just with one statement, you see, we put that whole range equal to one variant. You see, so you see how powerful and succinct VBA is. Variant arrays are always from a spreadsheet. When you take a variant array from a spreadsheet, it's always two-dimensional. Let's take a look at this. You'd probably look at that and say that's a one-dimensional array. Well, let's find out. If we, first of all, we will try and pick up those values. So I will declare an array called titles. I think I need to make a bit of a button here. I've made my button, but I'm just going to double click on it to set up some code. Okay, so I've dimmed my titles. Titles is going to represent that array. So now I'm going to set the variant titles equal to that particular range, or actually it's the wrong range. I'll just paste that in there, and I'll make it, we'll just put them down here, say what, for the moment. So we've said A1 to A3, which is A1 to A3. So if I click the button, that should just assign that range to that variable. Now the point I'm making here is that what happens if we try to message box out the one of the values? Well, let's try message box and the titles. And at first sight you might say, well, how about the second one down, and try that. Well, when you try it, it fails, and if we just debug, it'll tell you it failed here. The reason is that there's no such thing. That array is actually two-dimensional. That means I need to specify the row and column. So if it's the second one down, it's going to be the second row down and the first column, and that indeed gives us what we want. What about if we did have the elements in this direction? We need to change the specification here. So we're talking A1 across to C1 is our range, but once again, if we try to message box the second element, then you'd get an error here. So what do we do this time? Well, it's always going to be the first row, and in this case it's going to be the second column, so that should indeed give us what we're looking for. A very cheap and cheerful way of producing an array is using the array function. So let's take a look. If we use the array keyword, now be careful when you are programming. It's very tempting to use that as a variable, array such and such equals that, but it is a keyword, and you'll get an error if you try and use it as an array itself. So what we've done here, we've said we've used the array, and it's really just specified 3 elements of the array, but that means that we need to dim our array as a variant. So in other words, the sales will contain a variant. So we could message box out one of those elements. Which will be the first element, 2.34. Now you'll notice how it's what we call zero-based. The other arrays that we've been dealing with so far from the spreadsheet, the variant arrays, were one-based. They start from one. But this is rather a little hard to get used to, where we specify the first element at element 0, then 1, then 2. So the elements go, in this case, from 0, 1, 2. That's what you'll get when you use the array function. We could use option base 1 to change that, but this is just the usual state of things. Just to show you that it can hold other things beside numbers, in other words text, we can dim another array, which is our good friend company, and this time we specify strings. So I'll need to dim that array as well. And then if we want to print that out, we could just message box it out as well. So you get both of those. So it just shows you when you use the array, it's used to create a variant array which can either hold text or numbers. So using the array function makes a variant array, but we said that they're zero based. In other words, the first element is element 0. This is really a hangover from C language. If we were to make them one based, we can do that, as you will recall, by using option base 1. Then if you try it, we get an error which leads us straight to that error. You can see its message box 0 is wrong. That element doesn't exist anymore. So it's element 1. Isn't it nice how you can change things while the programming is held up as well? VBA is very forgiving and easy to use language. So I can just stop that now. And now if I run it, you'll see indeed we get the first element in each case. That's this element here, business systems, and this number here, which are now the first elements in the array because we've specified option base 1. I guess it's really a good idea when working with Excel to use option base 1 so that you have corresponding values on the spreadsheet, which of course doesn't have a cell 0. To use redim, sometimes we don't know in advance how big an array is going to be, so we might find out at runtime, or we might ourselves change our mind during the program as to how big the array is going to be. Now the trick is that we should start off by not using an index. So if I use that in here, I say that we just say we're going to dim the array, but we'll tell you in a moment how big it is. Well, what you can do is to find out at runtime how big it's going to be by some sort of integer value. You could get that integer value from the keyboard, but for the moment we're going to just put it in, hardwire it, so to speak. What we can do then is to redim our array. So those two go together, the redim and the dim in this case. So once again, you dimension it with no index. Then that allows you to use redim when you've made up your mind how big you want your array. So you're dimming it at runtime, really. That means we can now access element, we can set element 3, and indeed we can message box it out so we can see something. That message box out the element that we want. So that just shows you how you can determine the size of the array when you're running the program, and you can say, oh, it's going to be size 3 when the program is running, that is at runtime. It's quite quite an amazing feature. You try and do that same thing in C++ or C Sharp, and even Java, etc. And it's all sorts of bother, but VBA makes it simple. There's another subtle use of redim. Let's just say that I dim my array without an index once again. And then I say, well, in the program, I know it's going to have 3 elements. So you might say, well, that is just the same as saying dim company3 as string. Well, there is a subtle difference because that will allow us to change the size of the array later. So if you use dim and redim together, they will allow you to change the size of the array. Okay, so because indeed now we change our mind and we say we want to make 5 elements. The element contained 5 elements. So what we'll do, we'll message box out the element 0. Well, we'll message box it out, but before we do that, we'd better set a value. So we could set a value like this, assign a value. Like that. So just to reiterate, we dim an array without, and then we say dim company3. So it's got 3 elements, and basically then we set the first we set the first element to 0. So that's not correct. We need to make an element equal to something, and they're strings. So we set an element equal to that bit of text. Well, we could just leave that out for the moment and see if that works or not. Yes, we get ed. But now, if we do redim, you'll find the element's lost. You've made the array bigger, but you get nothing. So that seems to be a bit of a pitfall. Well, there is a way around that, and that is to use redim preserve. And you see ed is preserved. Then you're going to say, well, why did you tell me that in the first place? Why don't we just redim preserve all the time? Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Sometimes we can't use preserved. We can redim as much as we like, but sometimes we can't use preserve. Technically, we can only use redim on the last element, on the last index. And since this has only got 1 index, it is the last index, so we can use preserve. That's probably confusing you. Let me explain using a 2-dimensional array. So we'll use redim preserve on a 2-dimensional array. It's quite tricky to follow, actually, to understand when you can use preserve and when you can't. So please follow closely. What I'll do is put another button on the sheet, and then I'll make a 2-dimensional array. So I'll define it in two steps. So if I dim my sales array like this, which is going to contain single numbers, that is to say decimals, and then if I redim straight away, then like this, then that is saying we've got a two-dimensional array of a 2 by 2. Now that's just the same as saying sales 2, 2, except that we know we are going to change the size of the array later on. But for the moment, we'll just set one of the values, and then we might message box out that value as well. So let's just see if that works. No problem. That just gives the element 2, 2. So there's nothing unusual there. That's just really those 2 lines together dim the array as a 2 by 2, and then we're setting the element 2, 2 equal to that, then we're message boxing out. So there's nothing unusual about that at all so far. But what now if we want to change the size of the array? Well, we could try redim. And what we're going to do is to try and change, well, what we've done is made both the rows and columns bigger, but let's see what happens when we try to find out what our value is. In the first instance you've got that, but when it comes to this line here, we've lost our value because we've redimmed. And you might remember the way around that is to use preserve. Now there is a subtlety, so pay attention. Redim preserve. Well, let's just redim the second element, so that redim preserve, and then you change the second dimension, I should say, not second element, then it gives me that value, but it also gives me the other value. So hello, well, why didn't you just tell me this in the first place? Just use preserve all the time. You can redim as much as you like, but when can we use preserve? And the answer to that is we can only use preserve if we're redimming the second dimension. If I indeed try and redim that first dimension, make it bigger, watch what happens. Error, debug, and it takes me straight to the error. So the rule is that if you are using preserve, then you can only make the second element bigger. So in other words, the columns can only be increased. You cannot increase the number of rows. So it's some bit of like compensation, if you like. Now, well, let's go back to our, I'll just double check that that's still working. Yes, that's fine. So that's how we use redim. Once again, you can redim as much as you like. You can make them as big as you like, change the size. But if you want to use redim, you want to use preserve with redim to preserve your elements, then you can only redim the second dimension. So why did this work? I'll just remind you, if we click the button 1, it works fine when we use preserve. Well, the reason is when we redimmed, we only had one element, which is regarded as the last element. So we are redimming here the last element. So that allows us to use preserve. We now wish to make a user form. The user form is what it looks like. It's just a form which appears on Excel. You can take information from the user form and put it into your Excel spreadsheet. First of all, we go to the VBE, the Visual Basic Editor. I might just dispense with all of this code. And we go to Insert here. In Insert, a user form. And there's our user form. So if I also put a button on the sheet, just to make sure I'm on sheet 3, that's correct, I'll put a button on here for the moment because I'm going to use that button to display this user form. But you'll notice that these controls here are different from the controls for the spreadsheet. And for example, if we put a button, for example, a command button on here, and then we can put a text box on there as well, all sorts of controls which are rather nice. Now we can show that user form like this. If I go to the properties of the user form for a start, you'll see it here. I'll just go to the properties of that. I'm being a bit lazy because I'm going to copy the name of the user form, which is user form 1. I'd like to be able to right click on that and choose properties, but I can't. I have to actually go through this little beast here, and there it is, user form 1. I'm going to double click on that because that's the name. You could change that name to something a bit more useful, but what I'm going to do now is to go into the code. I'll double click on it. It's taking up my whole thing, so I'm going to have to close that properties there and find my code. There it is. So then I'll paste that in there, full stop, and see what comes up here. Show, that should, there we go, and I'll just double click on that method, and then if I take the design off and click my button, voila, there's my user form appearing. It might be a good exercise to try and say take some text from here and then click on the command button and paste it into cell A1. It might be a good idea to try that just now. I can now show one use of an array within VBA, and that's to populate a list box which is on a user form. So I've cleared all my controls from the user form. That should still be working, but let's take a look. That's fine, it just displays our user form. What I'm going to do is to put a list box on there. So we need our toolbox, and we can find the list box, which is just here somewhere. There we go. And draw a list box on there. I might just go and have a look at the properties of this. And it's list box 1. I'll just copy that actually and make a note of that, and close the properties window. What I'm going to do now is to try and populate that list box when the user form opens up. So if I double click on the user form itself, it takes me to, well, that won't ordinarily appear there. I'll just delete that. If we want to find the initialize event, it's the user form here, and these are the events up here. It's the user form initialize. So that's the initialize event. Now I want to put some code in there. I can get rid of this click event. I'm not going to click on the user form, so that I can get rid of that code and make. Now what we're going to do is to populate the user form using a list property, so that the user form has got this list box on it, and then it's got a list property, and that list property can be equal to an array. So we're going to call that array our good friend company, and we will declare the array, and then we'll populate it with some text using the very simple to use array function. So let's see if that actually works. We can click our command button, and indeed it does. So we've got those three elements being placed into the list box by use of the list property, and the list property requires an array, a variant array as a matter of fact, and there is our variant array specified in the code. If of course you want to close our user form, we can just click the cross and get rid of it. And then if this window is not appearing, we can actually double click on user form to get it back. What I'm going to do now is to write an event for the list box. So if I double click on the list box, it comes up with the list box click event. What I'm going to do is I want to click on that, and when on one of the elements when it appears. So if I message box list box 1 value, that's the bit I'll show you. Let me just run it first. I'm going to do that and then click on the first element, and it's going to produce business systems, which is the first value, list box 1 value, and then followed by the list box index, which is element 0, you see. So if I click on the next one, it produces the second element, and then the 1, which, so they're 0 base, so this one's 0, 0, 1, 2, and 3, 0, 1, 2 I should say. List box 1 value is the actual value of the text which appears here. List index is actually the numerical value. You can use that numerical value of course to test to see which one the user has clicked and maybe associate it with something else.